The contact period in the southeast dates from the 1500s to about 1670. We can divide contact into the protohistoric period and the historic Indian period. Protohistoric refers to Indians who have indirect contact with Europeans, whereas historic Indian refers to Indians who have direct contact with Europeans. Historic merely refers to having written records. During the early historic period, three major European nations claimed and occupied portions of the southeast: France, Spain, and England. Why? Well, the southeastern seaboard was important for provisioning ship travel from the Caribbean and South America to Europe. Spain ended up with control over parts of the Caribbean, Central and South America, including Mexico, the Southwest, California, and the Southeast from South Carolina into Florida. However, once the English arrived in South Carolina in 1670, the Savannah River, dividing South Carolina from Georgia, became the divide between Spanish to the south and English to the north. France ended up with control over the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and the Gulf Coast around the Mississippi River. They were never successful for long along South Carolina to the Florida coast, although they tried. England vied for control and territory with both France and Spain. During the early periods, the English ended up with control over parts of the Caribbean, for example, Barbados, and the eastern seaboard from South Carolina northward. In the 1700s, they gained trading control in the interior southeast, clear over to the Mississippi River. During the contact period, the first European explorations and settlements took place. European diseases were introduced, and Catholic missions were established in La Florida by the Spanish. The written accounts from Europeans provide limited descriptions of the landscape and of the life and inhabitants in the southeastern chiefdoms. Here we can see where the different tribes were located in the state of Florida at the time of European exploration. When Ponce de Leon explored along the southern coast of Florida in 1513, he encountered hostile Indians who had previously had contact with shipwrecked Spanish sailors. Ponce de Leon spent 9 days near Charlotte Harbor in southwestern Florida, where he encountered the Calusa. The Calusa lived on the coast and along inner waterways. They traveled in dugout canoes all the way to Cuba. They used very little pottery, but instead used shell. There's no stone in this area, so they used wood. The Spanish described the Calusa as tall and fierce. The houses were made with palmetto leaf roofs elevated up on stilts, no walls. Population at contact appears to have been between 4,000 to 7,000 people. Here's an artist's representation of the houses. This was a ranked society, a chiefdom, and yet they had no agriculture. Instead, they depended on fishing, hunting, and gathering. They made large platform mounds out of shell. These mounds were often connected by shell causeways. They also built canals, plazas, and sunken plazas called water courts. These canals were still visible in early historic aerial photographs. One was described as 30 feet wide and 6 feet deep. This artist illustration shows a typical mound center. Sand burial mounds were not located here, but instead were separate from the settlements and the mound centers. According to eyewitness accounts, in 1566, the Calusa king made an alliance with the Spanish governor Menéndez de Avilés. The king entertained the governor in a building so large that 2,000 people could stand inside. The Spanish witnessed elaborate rituals with synchronized singing and processions of masked priests. Inside a great temple, they observed walls covered by carved and painted wooden masks. 1896 excavations at Key Marco uncovered more than 100 wooden ceremonial masks, wooden statuettes, batons, and heads of animals, such as a wolf, sea turtle, pelican, and alligator. These were preserved because they were found in a layer of mud. The Spanish eventually tried to convert the Calusa to Catholicism, but they were never successful. Calusa remained powerful until 1698, but disease reduced the population to just 2,000 people. And in the early 1700s, the Calusa were overrun by slaver Indians from South Carolina and Georgia. And by 1750, to all intents and purposes, the Calusa were gone. A number of Spanish exploration and colonization attempts followed after 1513. From 1514 to 1515, Pedro de Salazar visited South Carolina barrier islands, and he captured 500 Indians, which he took back for slaves. The Spanish began making exploration trips into the interior, looking for gold and silver like they had found in Mexico and South America. The Spaniards were hostile. They commandeered food, carriers, and women, and they would take chiefs hostage. Hernando de Soto landed in Tampa Bay in 1539 with an army of over 600 men, 200 horses, a herd of pigs that he had brought from Cuba, and large attack dogs. They spent the winter in northern Florida and then traveled through Georgia, into South Carolina, up into North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and into central Alabama. They spent that next winter in Mississippi, and then next spring crossed the Mississippi River into Arkansas and returned to the Mississippi River for winter. De Soto died of fever. Only 311 survivors made it back to Mexico in 1543. However, several accounts were taken or written down from these travels. In talking about the journey from Cofitachequi or Acute in central Georgia to Cofitachequi in central South Carolina, all four accounts said that there was an uninhabited area buffering between the chiefdoms, and it required anywhere from 6 to 13 days. The accounts don't quite agree, but the consensus seems to be 9 days to cross this uninhabited area. There was no road, and 6 days past the border, the guides all lost their way. They told us that it was not possible to go there. There was neither a road nor anything to eat on the road. Back in Georgia, they had described the countryside between Ocute to Patofa, the last towns they visited in that chiefdom in Georgia, as a rich land, beautiful, fertile, well-watered, and with fine fields along the rivers. How wonderful to have a written description of a Mississippian chiefdom. Once De Soto's party had traveled through the uninhabited territory between chiefdoms and arrived in the chiefdom of Cofitachequi, one of his captains traveled 41.4 miles up the river. He went up into the higher ones. What does he mean by that? Did he mean structures on top of a mound? We don't know. And discovered that from there on up the river, the land was dotted with many pueblos, large and small, with many cultivated fields on all sides. Again, a wonderful description of fields within a chiefdom and a highly managed landscape. In 1540, De Soto spent time in South Carolina, visiting the chiefdom of Cofitachequi in the vicinity of present-day Camden on the Wateree River. He described a mortuary temple on top of the mound at Talamico. Inside were life-size wooden statues and chests full of goods, like pearls. In 1562, Jean Ribault of the French and 150 people settled on Paris Island in present-day Beaufort, South Carolina. They built a small fort called Charles Fort. However, the settlers rebelled and they returned to France. In 1564, a second attempt of French settlement was made. Laudonniere and 300 people settled at the mouth of the St. Johns River in northern Florida, building Fort Caroline. Laudonniere described what they saw among the Indians in 1562. During the winter, they retire for 3 or 4 months into the woods, where they make little huts of palm leaves and live on acorns, fish which they catch, oysters, deer, turkeys, and other animals which they hunt. They eat all their meat broiled over charcoal or smoked. In June of 1562, Charles Fort food ran short, and the nearby Indians gave the settlers food, except the seed grain they needed for sowing their fields. They told the Frenchmen further that because of this, they would have to go into the woods themselves to live on acorns and roots until the time of harvest should come. In 1565, Menéndez de Avilés and 600 men established St. Augustine near Fort Caroline in a deliberate effort to remove the French from the southeastern coast, and they killed the French. In 1566, Santa Elena was established in Port Royal Sound. It became the capital of La Florida in 1571. It was first occupied for a decade, 1566 to 1576, but then it burned. It was reoccupied for another decade, 1577 to 1587. But in 1576, when Santa Elena burned, the capital moved to St. Augustine, which was itself attacked and burned in 1586 by Sir Francis Drake. This action caused the Spanish to evacuate Santa Elena and consolidate at St. Augustine. Santa Elena, South Carolina was studied by Stanley South at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. He found a Spanish fort, a settlement, a Spanish pottery kiln, and underground barrel wells. You'll see a picture of those in a minute. He found 4 houses built like the Spaniards built, rectangular, single-post construction, and daubed walls. But he also found 1 circular house, like the Indians would build, and all of these were placed around a central plaza. Here's a computer-generated reconstruction. The highest-ranking people were the Spanish military. They lived in the fort at Santa Elena, and there's where you find the most imported Spanish goods. Spanish civilians lived in the rectangular houses outside the fort. They had lower status and fewer imported Spanish goods. You can imagine how expensive something coming by ship from Spain would be. The Spanish laborers had the lowest status, and they lived in round Indian-style houses, and Spanish goods were rare. St. Augustine, Florida, excavated by Kathleen Deegan, was laid out like communities in Spain, with a fort, residences around a plaza, and a church. Each house lot was laid out the same: a barrel well, seen here on the lower right, along the street, trash pits along the back fence, and sheep middens in the backyard. Imported Spanish goods were also linked to higher status here at St. Augustine. The most popular were the highly visible dining and serving ware and drinking glasses. The highest status people at St. Augustine also had the most imported Spanish food, such as wheat and barley, and also more hunted wild game as opposed to fish. Items with less social visibility were often Indian-made, such as the cooking and storage vessels that would be found only in the kitchens where the servants were working. Fish were considered by Spanish to be for lower class, whereas wild game was suitable for the upper class. Two styles of Indian pottery were found at St. Augustine: local pottery inside the fort and pottery from northern Florida outside the fort. It's thought that the pottery inside the fort came from goods brought to the fort by the local Indians. To obtain the labor of local Indians, Spain instituted the encomienda system. The Spanish leaders could force Indian leaders to supply labor and food in return for protection. Priests accompanied the Spanish on their exploration and colonization efforts, and the Spanish priests grew upset with the abuses to Indians under this system. The system was outlawed in 1542, but that outlawing was not well enforced. Thus, there was always a constant rift between the priests and the military men. Beginning around 1540, Jesuits tried to instead missionize the Indians, hoping that their converts would then supply the settlements with food. But after failures and massacres, the Jesuits gave up in 1573. The Franciscans were then assigned to set up missions, but Indians by then had become very anti-Spanish due to all the abuse they had suffered. And the Wateree Rebellion in 1597 along the Georgia coast destroyed the newly established Franciscan mission system. So that's over almost 60 years of trying to missionize. In 1598, Spanish sent reprisals against the Indians out of St. Augustine, and Franciscans continued to build missions, beginning with the Wateree along the Georgia coast and the Timucuan along the Florida coast, and they expanded inland to the inland Timucuan and the Apalachee. By 1674, there were 36 Spanish missions. These were successful because they converted the chiefs first, who then made the rest of the population convert. They located the missions across the plaza from the chief's house, and they tried to protect Indians from the worst abuses by the Spanish military. Additionally, these missions were trading centers. Many mission sites have been relocated for archaeological investigations. Missions had 4 parts: a church, a cemetery, a convento, where the friars lived, and a kitchen. The mission churches were rectangular with an earth floor. They often buried the converts under the floor. The congregation was buried in the nave facing the altar, and the priest was buried in the altar facing the congregation. Most buildings were made with wooden posts, and the walls were made with wattle and daub, and the roofs were thatched. They've also uncovered several of the Indian council houses. These were large, circular, anywhere from 50 to 120 feet in diameter. They were made with single-post construction, with large interior roof support posts, and a hole in the thatched roof over the central hearth, very similar to the types of structures that Indians had been making for hundreds of years in the southeast. The inside wall was lined with benches. Colonial ware was a locally made pottery. At Spanish mission sites, we believe it was made by Indian women, but they were making it in the shapes of European vessels. Later, at colonial period English plantations, some colonial ware is thought to have been made by enslaved Africans. And later still, some is thought to have been made by the Catawba Indians. Europeans' diseases decimated Indian society, causing population collapse by the mid-1600s. Indians were killed by diseases that did not kill the Europeans. Thus, even measles, the cold, flu, smallpox, and mumps were likely to kill Indians. In the 1519 smallpox epidemic, 50% of Timucuans died. In 1528, there was a gastrointestinal infection outbreak. The bubonic plague struck twice, 1545 to 1548, and again in 1613 to 1617. Typhus in 1549, mumps in the 1550, and 1559, the flu. I think this is something we can all appreciate now that we are facing our own flu-like pandemic. Population collapse meant that Indians had difficulty coping. They stopped building mounds. They abandoned settlements and reduced the size of settlements. They also moved the settlements off the major pathways and into the upcountry away, a little bit hidden. There was collapse of chiefdoms and ranked societies, a decline in craft specialists, sometimes a coalescence of groups coming together to help support each other. And most frightening of all, a loss of their oral traditions and their know-how. As a result, archaeologists find it difficult to trace Indians from the contact period into the historical period. It's difficult to link Mississippian Indians with present-day modern tribes living in the Southeast today. No direct European contact was necessary for disease to spread. All Indian populations suffered extreme population reduction and changes in their way of life.